Scottish Churches Conference, second tape. Dr. Ian Cowan, Department of Scottish History, University of Glasgow, the Scottish Church since the Reformation.
As Professor Barrow has demonstrated, Scotland in the Middle Ages did in fact possess a plethora of churches. I suppose if we try to quantify the actual churches which he mentioned in his talk, the total number would be something like 1,100. Had the number of churches in Scotland remained at that figure, then the task facing conservation might have been somewhat easier than it was to become. Because as we all know, over the succeeding centuries in Scotland, because of the history of the church and the difficulties that beset it, Scotland ended up with many more churches than possibly she could really afford to have. And I want in a way to try and comment upon this and give you the historical background to these particular events. At first, it certainly did not seem that the Scottish Church would move in that direction. Indeed, in some respects, the Scottish attitude towards churches was not, in fact, to build large numbers of churches. If you think of the Scottish boroughs, here the general feeling in the Middle Ages was that it was much better to have one very large church which served the borough as a whole, rather than perhaps a number of smaller churches as you find in English towns like Lincoln and elsewhere. Certainly, this was an attitude which could not be entirely maintained, and almost immediately after the Reformation, you begin to find that some of the larger churches at least were adapted to meet the needs of 2 or perhaps even 3 congregations. On the whole, however, the reformers were cautious in their policies towards the existing parish churches. They tried as far as possible to preserve them. It was certainly no part of the reformers' scheme to destroy assets in stone and mortar. Some churches certainly did, of course, suffer. But on the whole, the reformers simply wanted to ensure that kirks, in fact, were usable, that they were adapted to their particular purposes, and that on the whole they should be lock-fast, waterproof, and in general terms capable of serving the needs of the Reformed Church. Indeed, we find that many buildings were preserved because of this attitude. The abbeys, which Professor Barrow talked about, if not preserved in their entirety, were at times adapted to meet the needs of local congregations. Not always too successfully, because of course at places like Melrose and elsewhere, the roof eventually fell down and another church had at long last to be found. But on the whole, what you have for a considerable period after the Reformation in Scotland is the ideal of a single Protestant church, an established Church of Scotland which could, within its own confines, meet the religious needs of the nation. There was, in fact, a great horror of schism, and every effort was, in fact, made to ensure that other churches, other sects, would, in fact, be dissuaded from entering into Scotland. In the Cromwellian period, some sects did, in fact, enter into Scotland, but with very little success. Equally, the Catholic Church, or what remained of it, posed very little of a threat to the established church. Catholics, when they worshipped, usually worshipped in private chapels of families who had retained their faith. Here then, had this unity been retained, had the great desire of the great majority of the people been preserved, then we would in fact have had a situation in which church buildings would have been spread fairly evenly throughout the kingdom in response to the actual population needs. But this ideal of a unified church was to be broken. Broken, first of all, in the Covenanting era. You can see schism raising its ugly head in the church in about 1651, when 2 general assemblies actually materialized, one taking the protester view, another the resolutioner view. And this break was in fact to be made much more bitter during the Restoration era, during the period when we have the later Covenanters striving for their kind of religious establishment. Such Covenanters did, of course, meet frequently in out-of-door conventicles, but not all conventicles by any means were held out of doors, And when in 1687 some relief was given to the Covenanters by the Toleration Act of that year, they began in fact to seek more permanent meeting houses. The Revolution, of course, changed all that. The Revolution of 1688-9 gave to the Presbyterian Church repossession of the churches which it had lost at an earlier period. But schism now in fact was permanent. The difficulties which had arisen could not in fact be undone. Indeed, some of the Covenanters, the Cameronians, refused to enter into the established church, an established church which they felt had compromised itself by accepting certain conditions laid upon it by the state. Equally, and perhaps again more permanently, many of course refused to desert the Episcopal Church which they had found to their liking. And so you now have at least three definite bodies of religious opinion present in Scotland. The Catholics too, of course, have retained their position, but during much of the 18th century, neither the Episcopal Church nor the Catholic Church were able to make much headway. They were not able to worship very freely, not because government policy, certainly in relation to the Episcopal Church, was not friendlily inclined towards them, but because of the entanglement of both Catholics and Episcopal supporters with the Jacobites. They tended in fact to be persecuted, and the established Church of Scotland had for the time being a free run. But here too, if we look closely at the established church during this period, we can in fact see that all was not well with the established church. They too were on the brink of quarrel amongst themselves in terms of various basic controversies. A basic controversy which in fact had really been present since the Reformation in Scotland. That basic controversy was the question of authority between church and state. Where did the authority lie? Was the church, as the second book of discipline would have claimed, completely independent of the state? Could it do as it willed in ecclesiastical matters? On the whole, the state was not prepared to concede that particular point. And in particular, after the Union of 1707, certain acts were passed which seemed to hit at the whole basis of the established church. One of these acts was a Patronage Act, which restored the right of lay patrons in presenting ministers, here undermining the right claimed by the established church that it was the congregation who had the right to choose their own minister. But the real issue, perhaps, in all this was really much deeper than patronage. The Toleration Act of 1712 not only perhaps annoyed the established church because it allowed the toleration of the Episcopal Church, but it also raised the whole issue of oaths and whether in fact it was lawful to take an oath which seemed to recognize state authority over the church. Other issues were of a slightly theological base, but the Scots on the whole weren't interested in purely theological discussions. All the theological discussions which take place in the course of the 18th and 19th centuries have in fact at their root the whole problem of government and authority. Now you can see this coming out very clearly at the beginning of the 18th century in various causes célèbres at that time. A professor in my own university, Professor Simpson, was in fact arraigned in 1714 because he seemed, to some at least, to be stressing free will rather than the Calvinist doctrine of predestination. On the other hand, there were groups in the church who in fact wished to stress predestination, that man did not in fact possess free will. And this particular controversy came to a head in 1718 when the minister of Ettrick, a man called Thomas Boston, reprinted an earlier work called The Marrow of Modern Divinity. And here, in this book, the whole question of the assurance of election, which released members of the church from the consequences of the laws of Christ, was brought to a boil. Here, those who held perhaps more liberal views condemned Boston, condemned the marrow, but the controversy again rocked the church. Simpson in 1727 was once more to the fore in these particular controversies when he was accused of spreading the Arian heresy to his students, of denying the separate divinity of Christ. Simpson, lucky man, was in fact treated fairly leniently. He was suspended on salary and was able in fact to really live the rest of his days with no teaching duties and yet full stipend. I've been investigating the possibility years of Glasgow suspending me on very much the same basis, but I don't think it would work somehow or other in the 20th century. But the real point behind this, and I don't want to get into the controversies in a short lecture of this kind, the real question is that the authority of the church is now being questioned. And the most ready way in which authority could be seen to be questioned, perhaps, is on disputes over patronage, over the rights of patrons and others to actually place ministers, or the rights of the congregation to reject them. And again, here again we can see that various causes célèbres come to the fore in the course of the early 18th century. The first was brought about because a man, Ebenezer Erskine, who was minister of the West Kirk of Stirling, had been actually refused admission to a church at Kinross by the patron. This obviously rankled, and he found other like-minded ministers to join with him in 1733 at Gurney Bridge near Kinross, where he and his fellows declared that they had seceded from the Church of Scotland. They founded what they called the Associate Presbytery. The original secession had in fact been born. The church treated this very cautiously for a time, again perhaps indicative of the splits within their own ranks, but they couldn't ignore it forever. And you can in fact see in 1736, when Erskine and some others published their testimony, the kind of things that they were condemning the established church for. Erskine condemned the established church for failing to renew the covenants, for not condemning toleration, for not condemning, for their condemnation of the marrow. And here's the boot on the other foot in a sense, and also on their failure to excommunicate Simpson for his crimes. All these were very, very fundamental issues, and Erskine and his associates soon found others to join with them in this particular protest. By 1744, his protest group had grown sufficiently strong that he was able to organize 3 presbyteries, and the original secession now became known as the Associate Synod. This was a small beginning to what in fact was to become a very large secession, not only this, the original secession, but by others too, who were in fact alarmed by the official attitude of the Church of Scotland. But there were also schismatic groups within schismatic groups. We find, for instance, that the Associate Synod was soon split on an issue of a Burgess oath, whether such an oath was in fact legal or not. Was it in fact possible for people, for new burgesses, to swear to uphold the true Protestant religion presently professed within this realm, when perhaps they already had left the established church and were in fact now a member of the original secession? Some thought it was sinful and refused to take the Burgess oath. They became known as the Antiburgers and formed their own church, the General Associate Synod. And so you have the breach in 1748, in which burghers and anti-burghers within the original secession are fighting over points which they regard as fundamental and which we today would perhaps regard as fairly slender. And there were signs of similar movement elsewhere. A man called John Glass stressed the voluntary principle in religion, stressed the rights of private conscience, and he too gained adherents. And here the Glassites, or Chaelites as they're sometimes known, because they served communion and used broth rather than wine, became yet another splinter group moving away from the Church of Scotland. But the biggest group of all was in fact to appear in the 1760s, when a few dissatisfied ministers, who in fact again seized upon the problem of patronage, decided that they would form a relief church. A relief church based really on relief from patronage, but in fact took in almost anyone who was in fact dissatisfied with the present way in which the Church of Scotland was moving in the mid-18th century. Here, this was founded in 1761 and quickly again attracted many adherents in a very sort of certainly disorganized organization, if you can have such a thing. The links between them were not as great as the links would have been in an established church. The established church, clearly, in all this, suffered greatly. They were losing a large number of members in the course of the 18th century. It's been reckoned that by 1773 there were some 190 dissenting congregations in Scotland with 100,000 adherents. That number had risen to something like 150,000 adherents by 1800. And all this, of course, did in fact mean the building of more churches, the requisition of more meeting places, and all in all, the problem is already escalating by 1800, that more and more places of worship are in fact being provided within the bounds of Scotland. Equally, of course, this placed great strain upon the established church. Now you can see very clearly two parties within the establishment. The moderates, led by men like the historian William Robertson, who saw no evil in dining, wining, the theatre, various other pleasures like this, and whose approach in a way to the faith was certainly regarded by their opponents as extremely lukewarm. And here you have the tip, the iceberg, the tip perhaps of this struggle between the moderates and the evangelicals. But of course, again, the rift was much more serious, and it was really a whole question of attitude to the church which counted. But there was one overriding attitude which prevented the Church of Scotland, at this stage at least, from meeting total disaster. Many people still believed in the sinfulness of schism. They still believed that it was not in fact right to leave the established church. Rather, they should stay within the framework and fight their battles within that framework in the assurance one day they would be proved right, and they could then make the necessary changes which would bring the church back to the purity which they desired. That was the attitude of the great majority. It was this which kept the Church of Scotland at this stage as the majority church, and rightfully still gave it the right to claim itself as the established Church of Scotland. Elsewhere, within the other secession groups, you can in fact see the problems more easily materializing. Having made the original schism from the church, then it was all the easier perhaps to secede from the seceding bodies themselves. All sorts of controversies come to light. In 1782, there's the lifter controversy, whether it was correct to lift communion elements before or after prayer. This was a serious matter for some, which tended to split the Antiburgers synod. More serious, and this is where you can see people's views beginning to change greatly, is the whole question of the attitude towards the covenants, the whole question of just how far the covenants should be regarded as something which still ranked alongside the confession of faith, or whether the covenants now should simply be regarded as historical documents. Here the Burgers and the Antiburgers fell out amongst themselves yet again. One group, the New Lichts, thought of the covenants as a historical document. The Old Lichts still thought of the covenants as articles of faith. And so you get the situation developing, so well described in the works of Sir J.M. Barrie, when you end up with the original succession, now split between New Licht burghers and Old Licht burghers, New Licht Antiburgers and Old Licht Antiburgers. All, in fact, again, requiring places of worship, and sometimes, in fact, coming together in various cross unions to provide yet other bodies whose name I will not bother you with this morning.